So I've decided that the next part of the application that I'm gonna work on is the So initially what I thought I would do is I would write a resolver for creating a mutation and writing a routine into the database, as well as creating a query for fetching that routine. And that's fine so far, but imagine now that you want to fetch all the routines for a given user. Since we have no way to distinguish between two different kind of users, writing a query would fetch all routines, would give every routine that's stored in the database. So therefore I've decided to work on the authentication part to be able to distinguish between users. And that would in turn lead to whenever you write a query for fetching all the routines, you're gonna get all the routines that is created by a single user. So you wouldn't have to worry about fetching all the routines in the database. You would only get those that's associated with a specific user. So writing your own authentication from scratch in a safe way can be a very big undertaking. You can reach for external resources such as Firebase or Auth0. What I'm going to use is a library that's called NextAuth, and the reason why I choose NextAuth because it allows you to both not having to rely on external services, as well as the fact that you can bring your own database. So you own all your own data. You don't have to worry about it being spread around or Google possibly having access to your data, which is a big bonus for me. So that's why I'm going to use NextAuth. Okay, so I've added authentication to the project now, and it was quite simple actually. It only took a few minutes. So what you do is you need to add NextAuth as well as any adapter, and I've used the Prisma adapter because I'm using the Prisma ORM. And they give you examples on the NextAuth website on how you can implement different kind of OAuth providers, and they give you an example of GitHub, which I've chosen to do as well. I've chosen to use as well. And then what you can do is you set up these routes, and you get a client ID and a secret from GitHub when you create your OAuth provider, and then you save those in an environment variable, and then you use them. And the only real issue is that GitHub returns your profile ID as a integer. But since Prisma is typed, it's gonna expect a string. So that's why we have to take this profile object, which is returned from GitHub, and cast the ID from an integer to a string. So it sends it to Prisma as a string. And that's in a file which is called .nextauth.ts, and this is a next.js kind of thing where you can have a bracket and 3 dots, so it's gonna catch all routes here pretty much. So now if we go to our localhost and we go to /login, we can see that we're not signed in, but if we press sign in now, I'm gonna get to this sign in page, and I can choose sign in with GitHub, and you can style this as much as you want as well. And now it says I'm signed in as Oligarix, and I can sign out. And we can also see that now in our database, we can see, so we should be able to see now that we have a user, which is me, as well as a session, which is saving the session. So we're having access to the session in our database, which is super neat. So we've basically set up authentication in about 20 minutes with help of NextAuth. So it's a super good library, and I really recommend it. Okay, so we've added authentication to the project, and what I want to work on now is the ability to get a user ID from this session object, which is being sent with each request. And that's going to help us to differentiate between different users. So when we write a query for, say, fetching the routines, we're only going to get the routines that's associated with a specific user. Okay, so I thought I'd show you how we can get the actual user ID based on the request object that is being sent on each request when we have signed in. So what happens is that the request object is being sent and it's going to be handled by our Apollo server. And then we can call the get session, which we get from NextAuth, to get a session object. And this session object has a user and an email. And this email is super important. And that's because if we check our Prisma schema, we can see that each user has an email and that's unique. That's super important because then we know that we can query our database and use this email, and we're using this email to look which user corresponds with this email, which we do here, and then we can just return this user which uses this email. And when we have this user, we can get the user ID. And then we just need to set the user ID and return it, and it's gonna be available in all our resolvers. I also want to add middlewares to this project, and if you don't know what a middleware is, you can think of it as a function that's called either before or after your resolver is queried and resolved. And the reason I want to have a middleware is because in most of my resolvers, I'm gonna want to have access to the user ID. And I also want it to always be defined. And rather than having that logic replicated in each of my resolvers, I'd rather have a middleware which is placed in front of all my resolvers, which is called straight away when any resolver is called. And that middleware's purpose is to check that the user ID is defined, and if it isn't, it should redirect the user to the login page, or if they're just querying the API straight up, I want it to return an unauthorized response. And if the user ID is defined, then the middleware can just pass the query to the right resolver. Okay, so I found a middleware package for GraphQL called GraphQL middleware. And what it lets us do is apply this middleware before and after our resolver is called. So what's going to happen is that we're going to check this context object and check if the user ID isn't defined. If it's null, then it's going to throw a new authentication error and say you're not authenticated. Otherwise, we're going to wait for the resolver, and that means that we're just gonna pass this. We're just gonna pass it to the actual resolver, and then we're going to return it. So we have pretty much guarded our resolvers by using this GraphQL middleware. So now, if we go into our playground, and we do this hello query, we should get an hello world. But if we log out now, and now we do it again, we should get a not authenticated message. And if we sign in again, we should get, because now the request object is set again, and now we should get an hello world because now we're authenticated again, which is exactly what we wanted. Okay, so I think this is a good ending point for the video. We have set up one of those things which usually can be a very daunting task, and that is to set up authentication. We have added the ability to get the user ID and send it to the resolvers, and we've also added a middleware to check that the user ID is always defined. So I think that's good for now. So thanks for watching and stay tuned.